Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have Vijay Iyer with me from New York, I believe. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thanks, and you believe correctly. Glad to be with you.
Let's start with this, and I really don't like talking about current events or politics or anything like that because all of those things seem to pass and we don't think about it. But I believe we're going through a time in history where for decades and generations, if not centuries, people will talk about this moment. You're an educator, you teach at the Harvard University, and you also are an active performer. You record and you collaborate with so many artists. How do you deal with the current situation? How do you educate? How do you teach? How do you correspond with your students? And how do you perform and stay active?
Well, I've been rolling with it as much as anyone else, I guess. I haven't really felt the need to flood the internet with my live streams or anything like that. There's a lot of that happening. As a recording artist, I care a lot about what music sounds like and how it's presented. And, I've made a couple of dozen albums and I tend to just like try to draw people back to recorded music that we've already have a century's worth of sitting around, and I think that was already kind of like the original social distancing music making practice, right? It's like, well, I'm going to make this music today and someone will listen to it in a year or 10 years or 20, so it's, and in some other place, maybe by themselves, maybe many times over, so that's been a kind of like, in a way, I have to keep reminding myself and reminding everybody else that, rather than ask me to play online for free from my apartment in some poor audio conditions,
Yeah.
I might like say, why don't we listen to something that already exists? And at the same time, I have been a part of some projects that are very much of this moment. The violinist Jennifer Coe, who I've written a lot of music for, including a violin concerto, she started this kind of micro commissioning project, both to invite sort of more established composers to donate very short solo violin works and also to shine light on new emerging composers. So I donated a piece and I turned her on to this young composer performer named Morgan Guerin. And so the other night she premiered these things on Instagram Live. It's like a series of 30-second to 1 minute pieces, so there's an ongoing series of those, and they all sort of have something in common, a certain kind of melancholy and a certain tentativeness almost, or they all sort of end with this fade. Every single piece sort of ended by dying away or kind of melting into silence. And that seemed to indicate something about our collective feelings right now, as something of uncertainty and just patience, maybe, And I tended to think of it as like maybe I can write a soliloquy, for somebody to play to themselves. And I've also been so one of the courses I've been teaching this semester, which was obviously disrupted pretty severely, is called Advanced Ensembles Workshop. And obviously, ensemble means together, which is exactly what we aren't right now. We just retooled it. We were meeting on Zoom, and people are just making their own solo music and uploading it. And we sit and listen to what they've been able to make on whatever system they have, even if it's just on their iPhones or something like that. And it's been nice to just sit together with people and listen to each other's creations. So that's been like in a way its own kind of healing. Yeah. So basically, inviting people to keep creating and but not really with a huge agenda of dazzling everyone online but really more as a kind of healing practice or as a meditative practice, like something that's really about tuning in to oneself, making music for one, I mean, there are also these tools available for people to collaborate, overdubbing and, apps like acapella and stuff like that, which people have been using.
Yeah.
And so that's probably gonna continue too. Yeah, and then the other thing is my other course that I've been teaching this. It's a seminar that I've been leading this semester called Black Speculative Musicalities. Sort of been looking at the last century of African diasporic music with that particular ear towards like the imaginative, the sort of like dreaming a new world into existence kind of
Mm.
thing, which is less about heeding some kind of stylistic norms. It's more about kind of breaking the mold or exceeding the existing frame, and tying that to social conditions of the moment or political conditions of the moment has actually helped us listen better, to realize that a lot of this music is born of struggle, born of an experience of dispossession or of oppression or even of terror. And so that's kind of actually more relevant than we would have imagined, even, that just trying to help ourselves through this moment by learning from how people imagined a better future.
Before we got started, you mentioned something about family. You have a family, from what I understand, and how do you balance life, career? How do you balance that? Because I know I've spoken to a lot of musicians that have, at times struggled with it. How do you balance it? What advice would you give to some musicians who are struggling with the life career balance?
I don't know. It's been it's been an ongoing challenge for me, especially I live in New York City. I teach in the Boston area at Harvard. I so that's a weekly commute. I go there for a couple of nights a week during when under better under different circumstances than now. Although I've learned that wow, I could have maybe just been telecommuting this whole time. So that's its own kind of challenge, which is that I basically to work at all, I have to leave town. Almost always. I mean, I play a lot in New York too, but I travel a lot all over the planet as a performer and as band leader, perform my own music and so on. And especially, I have a daughter who's in ninth grade now, and so there's always been this feeling of, well, I guess they call it fear of missing out, but it's sort of like the opposite. It's like fear of missing out on what's happening at home, rather than fear of missing out on what's happening out at the club down the street or something like that. So it's more. So I guess that yeah, that ongoing challenge to find balance, and basically what I try to do is when I am home, I try to be as present as possible, not just kind of zoning out on devices and stuff, but
Yeah.
actually doing puzzles with my daughter, and just having dinner with the family and just being around. But yeah, I mean, that's like kind of one of life's great challenges, I think. I think that like especially for a child, it's important to see the parents happy and fulfilled. And so like me doing what I love to do and what I feel called to do in the world and being a part of a larger community, of people who are doing that too. I think that's been healthy to just for her to witness that. And the same with my wife, who's a scientist. She gives talks all over the world, visit, keynote lectures at conferences and stuff. And so she travels a lot too. And often we're doing these quick handoffs where she leaves just as I'm landing. Yeah, but I think so. There's a balance between like being present and then also being fulfilled. I guess that's what it boils down to. My daughter is pretty artistically inclined. I mean, she plays music a bit, but I think like she's really very talented visual artist, and so I think just getting to be around an artist and know that that's okay. Because most, in most sectors of certainly American society, being an artist is not really okay. It's it's not really seen as a, you're basically treated like you're a drain of resources, that you're doing something frivolous, that you're not helping anybody, that you're just kind of self-indulgent or something like that, which of course we know is not true, but that's kind of like the constant sort of undercurrent of the way people see us. So in a way, just being able to fight for the normalcy art making. It's like, I think it's important for any child to see
And maybe your daughter will design your next album cover.
that. I would welcome that.
You mentioned artists and the society, and how do we? This is a big question, but I keep thinking about this, and this is something I talked to a couple of my guests, including the jazz bassist Christian McBride. But I just want to know what we could do as artists to make sure that the society is more accepting of classical music, more accepting of jazz and arts in general. What can we do? Because what I've noticed, some of my colleagues, not all of them, but we tend to say, well, if the government supported the arts, it would be different. And if the administrators were more welcoming in public schools, it would make a big difference. But what can we do with that? Not paying attention to what anyone else is doing. What can we do as artists to just bring it to the world and share it with the world, and just have them be more accepting of what we do?
Well, that to me doesn't. I guess I don't experience that as the problem. you know, in the sense like, I mean, I'm privileged to get to travel a lot and play for all kinds of people all over the world, and I don't have this experience of like people not wanting it.
Yeah.
Whether it's me or somebody else. I think it's mainly at this point. I mean, now the question is like, what would get someone out of the house, and if we get to a point where that's safe again to do that, how do you convince people that it's worthwhile to gather rather than to stay at home and watch the infinite amount of content on the internet, on Netflix or whatever. I mean, I think people cherish music in their lives, really no matter who they are.
Yeah.
And I'm not really like so. I just want there to be quality. I want people to care about. I don't really care that whether they organize themselves under one genre or another. Like they say, like yeah, that jazz is it or classical music is it. I mean, I don't even really believe in these labels so much. I guess what pushes that music forward is a sense of community, and what keeps it alive, what keeps it afloat, and that's a sense of community among artists and among audiences, and so that to me is the real sensibility that we need to nourish, a sense of community, I think, rather than a sense of like consumer, the idea that you're just a consumer of music as if it's a substance or a product or an object. What it really is people doing things together. So that to me is like, in a way, that's the main thing to keep reminding people is that music is the sound of us being together and doing things together. That's sort of like the fundamental core of it. It's the sound of community.
I usually save the fan questions for the end, but I'll ask this now because it's really something I really enjoyed when I read this question. If you were to bring back one jazz legend to play with, who would it be?
First person who came to mind was Elvin Jones, who was one of the great drummers, played with Coltrane and with many other people. The polyrhythmic mastery, the sort of intensity, the buoyancy, the dance quality of his playing, and yeah, it was. I mean, it's so iconic. It was so definitive for a certain feeling in this music, and yeah, he's definitely. I mean, I got to see him live many times actually in the '90s and early two. I guess he must have died in the early 2000s. I don't remember the year, and I even got to meet him a couple times, and I always just cherished that feeling that he was able to to not just capture but kind of communicate to you like you just felt it from within. It was as if it was coming from within you. He had that capacity to just like reach into your body with sound, and so yeah, I would have loved to play with him, not for even any other reason except to just know what it feels like. I mean,
I,
whether it would just the two of us, or or whether it was like a public concert or anything, any chance to just commune with someone who had that kind of power.
I read that you also collaborated with Butch Morris,
Yeah, I did.
and years ago, maybe it was, I'm thinking about 10 years ago, he came to town and he was doing a master class on conducting and conduction and the method that he had. And unfortunately, I signed up for it. And then for family reasons, I had to leave town and I couldn't participate in that master class. And I miss it till this moment because he's no longer alive. I wish I had that opportunity to do it. So maybe something about Butch Morris that you experienced, a nice story, something that inspired you, maybe that you could share with us.
Sure. I mean, well, I got to know him for years in New York City and played with him in the early 2000. I guess it must have been around the year 2000, 2001, and got to hang out with him quite a bit. I remember, but I actually remember the first time I saw him, which must have been maybe 93 or 94 in New York City. I mean, I knew about him even then. I'd heard kind of like some people were totally in on like Team Butch, and other people were skeptical or felt it was like not all there or something like that. So I went to this place where he had gathered a bunch of really people who became legendary improvisers like William Parker, Susie Ibarra, Sabir Mateen. There's a whole bunch of folks at this place on the Lower East Side in New York, and I just remember like there was plenty about it that felt like fragile and almost barely there, and then there would suddenly be this moment where you felt like something majestic happening, and I'd mean at the level of form. I guess that's what I mean, because what it amounts to is a lexicon of cues that he uses to summon sounds from an ensemble and from basically like y- every sound that somebody makes is a creative choice of some kind, but it's in relation to very specific parameters that he's setting forth. Um, and so it can feel sometimes like anything could happen and whatever just happened will never happen again. And because of that, you can start to feel lost in it. But then he had this one cue that had to do with summoning something that had happened before. Like basically you would store a section that just happened and then you'd bring it back much later. So then suddenly form is created on this very large scale. It could happen like 30 or 40 minutes later. Something that you heard at the beginning of the set is suddenly recurring. And then you had layers and layers of that possible. So he could actually build kind of like a symphonic level of form in real time out of from the air. Basically, just pull it out of the air, and it was you know, that's when it really hit me.
Yeah,
Like, oh, like it or not, this guy's really achieved something that no one imagined possible.
yeah,
He really, what we thought composition was, he's kind of proven that that we can do it in this moment. He's shown us what form is, something like very fundamental about form and memory, you know, um, and and listening, really profound listener. so so I remember one time can I swear on this? Because I wanted to quote him.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I remember, like, he was also known as a cornet player, and there's some wonderful recordings of him playing in the 70s and 80s. So I remember at some point in the early aughts, I asked him if he still was playing cornet, and he said, "I put it out of my motherfucking house." He said, like, basically, he got rid of the cornet. It was somehow a problem for him, and so I guess he had been focusing on that craft for so long, and he really refined it to this
yeah.
remarkable degree.
Yeah, and he's such a fascinating person and a musician, and that's what when I think of some of the greatest jazz musicians, and it is exactly what you described. They're able to do that in the moment, and of course they practice it. You practice that, the improvising especially, but as a classical musician, as a conductor, it's the improvising. Even though I've done it since I was young, I've improvised or tried to at least. So I've always been fascinated with that. But in classical music, you're not really encouraged in many ways to do that. But the crazy thing is that in Baroque era, some of the greatest classical musicians, what we call them classical now, were also to a certain extent improvisers, and somehow that was lost. And I really wish that it somehow comes back, and I hope it comes back on a very early education level, because I have an interesting story. I had this violinist, Andrew Jocelyn. He's played with a lot of pop stars and rock musicians, and he came and did a master class with one of my youth orchestras. He played with us, and then we asked some of the kids to play some improvised on very simple chord progressions. And some of the youngest kids, 10 years old, they got up there and they just did it without worrying about anything. And I had the opposite idea. I thought the 17 or 18-year-olds might have an easier time. They got up there and sort of froze, and they were like, well, what note should I play next? What should I do next? When these
Right.
girls, they just went for it. I was such an amazing experience for me to see that, because I realized that we could even start that at an early age and get them excited about this amazing way of communicating through music and improvising. So some of the greatest jazz artists for me have been able to do those. The form that you talk about are able to build that. Even just playing standards, they're able to do these things, and it's such an amazing thing to hear and see. And so, thanks for sharing that.
Of course.
I wanted to know a little bit about some of the early inspirational figures for you. And you talked about Butch Morris, so that's one. And I don't know if it was early on in your career or not, but as a young musician learning music, what were you inspired by, artists or music? And I know you played violin as well. What are some of those inspirational moments that really led you to become a musician?
Oh, wow, so many. I'd say like so. I grew up in the '70s and '80s. So formative music for me was like Michael Jackson and Prince. And I'd say that it was Prince's musicianship that kind of really caught me in a way. I mean, like you said, I played violin from when I was little, and I also played piano so I had violin lessons from age 3, and I also just played piano by ear the entire time, just on my own. Um, I didn't care. Like I was like one of those little kids who didn't care what anyone thought. I was just doing it for myself, you know. Um, and and then I'd say that when I really zeroed in on Prince and his music and his musicality, his musicianship, and his like total command of every aspect of music, of songwriting and form and production and sound and singing and playing every instrument, and um, that sort of like I realized like, oh, there's so much to learn here. It's I basically just became obsessed with his music in the '80s, and that was when, to me, like that was his golden era of everything from 1999 to I don't know, Sign of the Times, Love Sexy, Purple
Yeah.
Rain, of course, and Around the World in a Day, and those albums. Like there was so much nuance and just like the role of the rhythm guitar, or in the particular orchestration of the drums, or progressions, or like when things would change. You might have a groove that just sort of goes on for 8 minutes, but then there would be these episodes when different layers would get added or subtracted. So that kind of was like, little by little thing, a lot dawned on me about what music could be. um, at the same time, I was studying classical violin in high school. I studied with this teacher named Oliver Steiner, who was a student of Dorothy DeLay.
Oh, wow.
So he was like a contemporary of Itzhak Perlman and Emmanuel X and all these. In fact, I remember he did a recital with Manny. um, I grew up in Rochester, New York, so he was on faculty at Eastman School, even though I was just studying with him privately. And he had this real like philosophical perspective on music, and there's this like real organic kind of awareness of phrasing and expression. And I remember he had this like rubber plant in his office, and he would just kind of like push on one of the leaves and just let it kind of like oscillate back and forth and then reach equilibrium. Then that was like a teaching, like he would use that as an example of like bowing, stuff like that. So it was like really this like broader, very philosophical awareness of what I was doing, and I think that was really influential for me. And then when I was in high school and I started getting into trying to play this thing called jazz, and I got let into the high school jazz ensemble, and then like I had to kind of get up to speed very fast, and like just trying to figure out how to function in the rhythm section and stuff. And so I started getting LPs out of our local library. This is in the mid '80s, and when I just remember when I heard Thelonious Monk for the first time, um, I was mystified because he didn't seem to be doing what anyone else in the same category was doing. And then a couple of years later, when I saw footage of him playing, this was of course long before YouTube, but there's a film that came out in the late '80s called Straight No Chaser, which had a lot of documentary footage of him in performance. And there was something about it that connected for me, like just his relationship to the instrument was so personal
Hmm.
and so intense,
Yeah.
and so playful. So I guess like that combination of like it just felt so alive and so full, like so sonically full, like at the vibratory level, and then the rhythm was so strong. So I don't know. I guess I was drawn to everything about it, and I felt like I related to it. Like not that I already sounded like that or anything, but that there was something about his relationship to the instrument that I could relate to from like almost at the physical level. Like it made sense to me to play the piano that way. So somehow those three, I'd say, were like the beginnings. In the '90s, when I lived in California, I got to play with some elder musicians who were basically part of jazz history. One was Donald Bailey, this drummer who played in the '50s and '60s with Carmen McRae and Jimmy Smith and Hampton Hawes and a lot of people. And he had just kind of like settled on the West Coast, and but he was from Philadelphia originally. But he had a real dynamic and like very creative way of playing drums. Like never settled for patterns. It was always like something new. It was like he was always creating a drum set. Even creating the drum set itself, he was sort of like he would assemble a, like he would add new parts to the kit that was just like from household objects and stuff. It
Wow,
was really,
that's awesome.
it was great. Another was this drummer named E.W. Wainwright, who actually was a student of Elvin Jones, who I mentioned
Uh-huh.
earlier. And I played in his band for years. And he was like, decades older than all of us, but he would wear us all out. He had so much fire and intensity. And then around that same time, I was studying with I got to connect with three really important mentors. One was David Wessel, who's a pioneer in computer music and electronic music, and also in the science of music perception and cognition. Another was the composer Ollie Wilson, and another, probably, really pivotal person was George Lewis, the composer and scholar, and trombonist, improviser. So all three of them had a huge formative impact on me. And then also around that time, I started touring with Steve Coleman, who really, basically, he's one of the reasons I became a musician for life. I hadn't really been on the career path of becoming a musician. I didn't really know that that was available to me. But around the time I was 23, I started actually, he just called me out on the road with him. I started touring with him and stuff. And then that was kind of like I took it literally. I was like, well, I guess I'm really being called to do this. I should take it seriously and try to live up to it.
Yeah. Do you still play the violin after all these years?
Well, I started picking it up about 10 years ago when my daughter started taking lessons, and I would just sort of accompany her. It was like kind of nice to start fresh after,
Yeah.
20 something years, almost, 25 years, um, and just like
Yeah.
play long tones and like focus on tone and intonation and not trying to impress anyone. So, so that's actually been really helpful for me. And then also in this time, I've been writing a lot for classical musicians like Jenny. I wrote for Matt Heimovitz, wrote a solo viola piece last year. I've written chamber music and orchestral music and a lot of different things. So it's often like if I'm writing for a string quartet, I'll just kind of get it out again, get the violin out to try to figure something out about the instrument. And also last year when I was writing that viola piece, I rented a viola and I kind of fell in love with it. It was sort of like it was everything that I wished the violin had been all that all these years. In the sense that it was, like I could play it, but I didn't. Uh, I mean, in the sense like I could get around it, I could get a decent sound out of it, stuff, but it didn't have that shrill sound I associate with the violin. That's sort of like the sound of my nightmares after all these years. So I kind of, I'm treating the viola like now part of my arsenal. I still have it and been playing around with it.
Interventions. Is that your first orchestral work?
Yes, that was from 2007, I think.
Is that did you get to that moment where you're composing for big orchestra? Did you already compose for quartets and solo instruments before?
I had, yeah, and I guess like I'd done a major project with a string quartet called Ethel in 2005. There was piano and string quartet and electronics, and it was just like 45-minute piece of music, a suite called Mutations, which is actually out of it came. We recorded it. I recorded it with a different ensemble about 6 years ago, and I'd been doing other pieces of that kind, also like large scale kind of multidisciplinary projects with poets and stuff. So then I was invited by American Composers Orchestra to write something for them, and that was so it was a chamber orchestra, actually, 30 players, kind of the same. Actually, a point of reference for me was Ligeti's Piano Concerto, but I also didn't want it to be a piano concerto. I kind of wanted to just be in the ensemble as a kind of free agent, but not as a soloist exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of Duke Ellington's role in his ensembles, which was someone who, he had like complete structural command of all the music. Like he knew what it was, he knew everything about it, and he would play just these like very brief little interjections here and there to kind of accentuate things. So he was like this intelligence within the ensemble who could kind of punctuate or accentuate or shade or color without having to really draw too much attention to himself. So that was sort of how I approached my role. It's funny, I remember George Lewis, who I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When I got the commission, he pulled me aside and he said, don't make the mistake that a lot of first-time composers make, or first-time like orchestral composers make, and especially people who come out of the, I guess, jazz, creative music world, sort of tend to misuse or underuse the capacities of the orchestra in terms of colors and just what you can do with the ensemble, how you get power out of the ensemble, how you get treating it as this laboratory for sound and color. So he kind of just hit me to a lot of contemporary orchestral works that I remember Vanity by Richard Barrett, some pieces by Maglis Lindberg and Kaya Saryaho. Different approaches. I think part of what often happens is that, especially for people coming from the jazz world, is they might, their awareness of orchestral music might stop at Rite of Spring, which is like more than a century ago.
At this point,
so this was like he was just sort of like trying to get me up to date about things, and that was really helpful. So not that I feel like I have to. I mean, I try to speak from where I am. I don't try to pretend I'm somebody I'm not, but I do like to at least be aware of what's possible, even if I choose to reinvent it on my own terms.
If you, this is because I also work with a lot of youth orchestras, I conduct a lot of youth orchestras. From this perspective, would you ever approach or compose for an ensemble that you had some restrictions for. As in, when you're composing for a professional orchestra, you're sort of, to a certain extent, you could pretty much give them whatever you want and get most of it back. With the youth orchestra, when you compose for youth orchestra, you sometimes have to deal with some restrictions, as in you can't really push them to those limits, I guess, that you can with the professional orchestra. Would you take on a project that you had restrictions on?
That's funny that you put it that way, because I guess I'd say that my experience has not been that professional orchestras can play anything, anything at all. I mean, there are already lots of constraints. Usually, the main constraint is rehearsal time, right?
Of course.
I mean, just because that's prohibitively expensive, especially in the U.S.
Yeah.
I don't know I suppose if I went to like Prague or something, I might have it might cost a little less. And then the other thing is like a certain kind of rhythmic awareness that I'm very accustomed to from the circles I've traveled in. I mean, all the people I've mentioned, like Elvin Jones and Thelonious Monk, there's like a rhythmic specificity there, a real like awareness of pulse and subdivisions and basically like groove sensibility, I would say, that you can't always count on with classical musicians because they just, it's like a different accent, it's like a different emphasis with rhythm, a different way of dealing with pulse. You know this as a conductor. Like what I'm used to with kind of groove oriented music is that the pulse comes from within the ensemble, like everybody kind of has this shared sense of it. They're not relying on some external visual cue to make that happen. And so like that has been this ongoing negotiation with me. Like what I've found working with orchestras trying to execute certain rhythmic ideas that I've had is they just don't approach it the same. Like classical musicians just don't approach it the same way that I would. And I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, of course.
So so basically like no matter who you're writing for, there are constraints. I guess I'd put it that way. And so I guess I always try to write to that situation. And then it's also just about like my goal isn't to make music that's really hard. It's actually just to make something that feels authentic to me and that might feel meaningful to somebody else. And whether it's I don't know, meaning doesn't just come from virtuosity, right? It comes from, I hope, from some deeper sense of expressiveness that and from some like human core. So that's kind of I guess the short answer is I'd be happy to write for a youth orchestra. I think there's a commission in the works for me to write for the youth orchestra I used to play in Rochester.
Oh wow!
So I'm hoping that comes together. So that really really exciting. I mean that was so formative for me. I remember I joined the orchestra when I was 12 or something, and maybe 12 or 13, and I was just stuck in the back of the second violins. So, but then I was like, whoa, this, just like the richness of sounds coming from every direction around me was so intense. Like I remember that year we played Sibelius Second, and we spent like the whole year working on it. So I just learned every bar of that, every bar of that symphony. I still know all of it to this day. It's still like within me because I just like saw it being assembled from its components and heard it. Like heard every, and that like being immersed in orchestra and feeling orchestration from within is really, that's like, to me that kind of was the best teacher I ever had.
Yeah. And youth orchestras teach so much more than just music and playing together. They teach collaboration. They teach how to work in a team and listen to each other. There's just so many other things that are very important. And I always recommend youth orchestras to just about anyone because it's just a great way to experience life. Just another way, I guess I should say, to experience life. I want to say something about orchestras and working with orchestras. I remembered when you were talking about working with the orchestra, I remembered Frank Zappa because when he had his collaboration with the London Symphony Orchestra, he had a lot of frustrations and he talked about how he felt like there was not enough rehearsal time and and he didn't get the musicians to do all the things that he wanted rhythmically, the orchestra to do. So I remember reading that when you were talking about it, I almost felt like I'm hearing Frank Zappa talk about all of this.
I believe it.
Yeah,
It's an ancient problem, I
yeah,
think. I mean, it's a trade-off with resources, but then also you might have these like kind of clashes of aesthetics. I mean, I would say like business about rhythm and like the kind of differing awarenesses of rhythm in these different musical communities. I've found myself often just right on that frontier, like working with. I did a large project with Brentano String Quartet, who are amazing. They're just like one of the best in the world at what they do. And I just remember like we had to just kind of find a different way of moving together, like pulse wise, like how to deal with pulse and how to deal with, I guess like the main, for an ensemble like that, the main parameter is tempo itself, like that's what varies. So, as you might you might warp the tempo to bring out a cadence in a certain way, for example, to sort of emphasize it or to bring out its kind of hidden meaning or something like that. In these kind of groove contexts that I'm used to, it's not tempo that varies. It's basically your relationship to pulse that is more expressive, but the pulse itself is consistent. So, like that kind of clash of of systems, I guess, just the clash of awarenesses, working with them at such an intimate scale, like where they're just a few inches away from me, and
yeah.
we're sort of somehow trying to play the same music, like be in the same place, like arrive at the same time. That was really educational for all of us. So I guess I find that that's like the ongoing issue all the time when I try to work across that divide.
We're already way past how long I was going to have you on here, but you're just such a fascinating individual, and you're an ideal guest for a podcast where you're just able to talk about some of these things in depth to a certain extent. So it's great having you. I don't want to keep you for any longer. A couple more questions, and maybe short answers if you want short answers, but. Some of them you might not be able to do short answers, but a life-changing moment, whether it's musical or non-musical, life-changing moment.
There's been so many, but I guess the one that flashed in my head just then was Roscoe Mitchell, the great saxophonist, multi-instrumentalist, composer, improviser, who one of the founding members of the Art Ensemble of Chicago.
Yeah.
I remember in the early '90s when I had just recently moved to California, and he came out to play at this memorial concert for a musician who had just passed away named Gerald Oshita, who had been a collaborator of his. I guess I kind of just got dragged to it. I didn't really know what I was getting into, and I remember like he played this solo alto saxophone meditation that had almost no sound. It was like he passed air through the instrument but didn't make any tones. So he just kind of found all these different ways to not make a sound. But it was this riveting performance that, I mean, even describing it kind of reduces it in a way, because there was something so vulnerable about it and so profound, and it shocked me really that this too could be music. This profound performative gesture of tribute that was almost silent, that had its own musicality to it at the same time. And yeah, I haven't been the same since that day, honestly.
And Art Ensemble of Chicago is actually one in high school. That's when I got really into jazz. I was really interested, and I had a teacher. I said, "Hey, can you recommend me some record to start off listening to jazz?" And for some reason, he was like, "Well, go check out Miles Davis and Coltrane and Art Ensemble of Chicago." I was like, "Okay." So I did, and Art Ensemble of Chicago just really stuck with me more than anything else. It just
Yeah.
just everything that they were able to do in that group, it was just so fascinating. It's all I've been a fan for such a long time, and I'm so happy he recommended that. Although for me it was just way beyond me at the time. I was like, wow, this is just overwhelming in many ways.
Yeah.
One last question. People know you, as a jazz pianist, even though I really wanted to get into genre, but maybe a podcast for another time. And I know you would have interesting things to say about jazz or just thinking about genre specifically and should we call it certain names. But that's maybe for another time. People know you as a pianist. People know you as a composer. People know, maybe some of them know now that you have a family. But something that your fans or people in general would not know about you that you're willing to share with us.
um, I guess like maybe that I don't know if it's really that much of a surprise to anyone, but I'm a kind of like a big sci-fi fan.
Okay.
So read a lot of kind of nerdy science fiction, like some of the hard SF as they call it, but also lately I've been really interested in science fiction by authors of color, in particular, like N.K. Jemisin and Nalo Hopkinson, Octavia Butler, of course, Ted Chiang, Ken Liu. So it's just been, I guess that's kind of what fuels me. And it had to do with maybe what I was talking about earlier, which was like, how is it that people imagine a world other than the one we have?
Mhm.
You know, and I think there's always this kind of political angle in science fiction, which is basically it kind of often amounts to a critique of the present. You know,
Yeah,
even if it's sort of dreaming about some impossible future.
yeah,
And so that I've found has been a nourishing space to you can nerd out, but it's also a space to kind of rethink what it is that we have in the first place.
yeah.
And that's also like for me, it's important as a music maker, as a composer, as a someone who creates in the present and also creates for the future to be able to imagine on that kind of scale.
Well, thank you so much. This
Of
was
course.
great. Thank you so much for being on this podcast, and hopefully we can do some in the future because I still have questions for you, but we're basically out of time at this point.
All right.
Thank-
So
I
we'll
have-
do part two some other time. All
Yeah,
right.
thank
Thanks
you.
so much.